On the morning of March 4th, 1918, a coal tender named Triton was making her way north through the Caribbean, her crew squinting into the haze of a warm Atlantic dawn. Somewhere off the coast of Barbados, a deckhand spotted a shape on the horizon, a vessel so large she seemed to flatten the sea beneath her. He called it out and the men gathered at the rail to watch her pass. She was the USS Cyclops, a Navy collier, 542 feet long, her twin smokestacks trailing ribbons of dark smoke into the cloudless sky. She was riding low in the water, lower than any of them had ever seen a ship ride, her hull painted the dull grey of war. She was moving slowly, deliberately, and as she passed, one of the Triton's officers noted the time in his log, 10:15 a.m. No one aboard the Triton knew it yet. No one in the world knew it. But they had just become the last human beings to see the Cyclops alive. Somewhere between that moment and the port of Baltimore, the largest ship in the United States Navy would simply cease to exist. She would take with her 306 men, sailors, marines, officers, civilian passengers, and her German-born captain, and she would leave behind nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no oil slick, no life ring, not a single splinter of wood. The sea would close over her as though she had never been, and for the next century and beyond, every official inquiry, every board of investigation, every expedition and theory and desperate hope would end with the same 4 words: cause unknown. It remains the largest non-combat loss of life in the history of the United States Navy. It remains, more than 100 years later, entirely unexplained. I have spent months now inside the archives of this story. I have read the Navy's investigation files, the Bureau of Navigation's correspondence, the private letters of the families who never stopped asking why. I have traced the careers of the officers, the debts of the captain, the manifest of the cargo hold, and I can tell you this: the more you learn about the Cyclops, the less the silence makes sense. She was not a small vessel in an empty sea, she was a floating city, equipped with wireless telegraph, manned by experienced sailors, travelling one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes on Earth, and she vanished as completely as a stone dropped into black water. This is not a story about the Bermuda Triangle. I will not be reaching for supernatural explanations or convenient mysteries. This is a story about a real ship, real men, real families, and the institutional silence that swallowed them all. It is a story about a captain whose loyalty was questioned, a cargo that may have been a death sentence, and a navy that, in the chaos of war, may have looked the other way rather than admit what it did not know. And it is a story that does not end in 1918. 23 years later, in the same waters, travelling the same route, the Cyclops' 2 sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, would disappear as well. Identical vessels, identical cargo, identical silence. 3 ships, more than 500 men, 0 answers. By the time you finish watching this, you will know everything the families knew, everything the Navy knew, everything the historians have pieced together in the centuries since. You will know about the missing inspection reports, the overloaded holds, the espionage whispers that dogged Captain Worley to his grave and beyond. You will know about the wives who waited at the docks in Baltimore, the children who grew old without fathers, the unmarked graves that exist only in memory. And you will understand why, even now, the official record still reads the same way it did in 1918, cause unknown. The United States did not want the Cyclops, not at first. She was built in 1910 by the William Cramp & Sons ship, an engine-building company in Philadelphia, one of 3 sister ships designed for the Navy's fleet of colliers, the unglamorous workhorses that kept the warships fueled and the fleet moving. The Cyclops, the Proteus, and the Nereus were not built for glory. They were built for cargo. 11,000 tons of it, to be exact. Coal, ore, munitions, supplies, whatever the Navy needed hauled from one port to another. The Cyclops was the first of the 3 to be launched. On May 7th, 1910, she slid down the ways into the Delaware River, her hull gleaming with fresh grey paint, her bridge towering above the waterline. She was, at the time, the largest fuel ship in the Navy's inventory, and she was given a name from mythology, the one-eyed giants of Greek legend, the creatures who forged the thunderbolts of Zeus. It was meant to suggest power, strength, unstoppability. What it suggested, in the end, was something else entirely. The Cyclops' early years were unremarkable. She ferried coal along the Atlantic coast, resupplied the fleet during exercises, made the long run to the Caribbean, and back more times than anyone bothered to count. Her crew rotated through the usual Navy channels: enlisted men from the coal towns of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, officers fresh from Annapolis, a handful of Marines assigned for shipboard security. She was not a prestigious posting, she was not a glamorous one, but she was steady, and she was dependable, and in the years before the war that was enough. The war changed everything. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the Navy's fleet of colliers suddenly became essential to the war effort. The Cyclops was pressed into service hauling supplies to the naval base at Guantanamo Bay, then to the coaling stations in the Caribbean, then to the distant ports of South America, where American ships refueled before crossing the Atlantic to join the fight. It was on one of these runs that the Cyclops acquired her final, fatal cargo. In early 1918, the ship was ordered to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to pick up a load of manganese ore. Manganese was, at the time, one of the most strategically important materials in the world. It was used to harden steel, to make the armor plating that protected warships, to forge the shells that American guns were firing at German trenches thousands of miles away. The United States had almost no domestic supply. Brazil had mountains of it, and the Cyclops was one of the few ships large enough to carry the ore in the quantities the war demanded. She arrived in Rio in late January, her holds empty, her crew restless after weeks at sea. The loading took more than 2 weeks. Manganese ore is dense, far denser than coal, far heavier than any cargo the Cyclops had been designed to carry. The ship's rated capacity was 10,500 tons. By the time the loading was complete, she was carrying more than 11,000. Some of the crew noticed. The ship sat lower in the water than she ever had before, her hull riding so close to the surface that the waves lapped at the lower portholes. The chief engineer, a man named George Worley, no relation to the captain, filed a complaint with the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, warning that the ship was dangerously overloaded. His complaint was acknowledged. It was filed. It was forgotten. The Cyclops left Rio de Janeiro on February 16, 1918, bound for Baltimore. She made a brief stop in Bahia to pick up additional passengers, consular officials, naval officers travelling home, a handful of civilians whose names would later appear in the missing rolls, and then she turned north into the open Atlantic. On March 3rd, she arrived in Barbados. Bridgetown Harbour, Barbados, was one of the most important coaling stations in the Caribbean. Every ship travelling between South America and the eastern seaboard of the United States stopped there to take on fuel, to top off supplies, to give the crew a few hours of shore leave before the final leg of the voyage. The Cyclops dropped anchor in the harbour on the afternoon of March 3rd. Captain Worley came ashore almost immediately, walking the dusty streets of Bridgetown with a restlessness that several witnesses would later remember. He was a large man, heavy-set, with a thick German accent that he had never quite managed to shed despite decades in the American merchant marine. He had been born Johann Friedrich Georg Wichmann in 1866 in the town of Hildesheim, in what was then the Kingdom of Hanover. He had immigrated to the United States as a young man, changed his name, built a career in the merchant service, and eventually received a commission in the Naval Auxiliary Reserve. But in March of 1918, with the United States at war with Germany, Captain Worley's background was not an asset. It was a liability, and he knew it. Several of the officers aboard the Cyclops had already filed complaints about his behaviour. Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley, the ship's executive officer, who shared the captain's surname but not his blood, had written to the Bureau of Navigation expressing concerns about Worley's fitness for command. He described the captain as erratic, temperamental, given to violent rages and arbitrary punishments. He described a man who paced the bridge at all hours, who refused to delegate authority, who seemed to trust no one aboard his own ship. Other officers whispered darker things. They said Worley had been overheard speaking German to himself in his cabin. They said he had made comments sympathetic to the Kaiser. They said he had been seen more than once studying charts of the German-held islands in the Caribbean, as though planning a route that no American officer should have been considering. None of these accusations were ever proven. None of them were ever formally investigated. But they hung over the Cyclops like a fog, and they would shape the narrative of her disappearance for decades to come. In Bridgetown, Worley went about the ordinary business of a captain in port. He filed a report with the American consul, a man named Brockhurst Livingston, noting that the ship had arrived safely and would depart the following morning. He arranged for the transfer of coal and fresh water. He visited the harbour master's office to update the ship's manifest. And then, according to Livingston's later testimony, Worley said something strange. He said that one of the Cyclops' 2 engines was broken. He said the ship had been limping along on a single engine for days. He said he was not certain the vessel could make it to Baltimore. Livingston asked if Worley wanted to delay the departure, to wait for repairs, to request assistance from the Navy. Worley refused. He said the ship would leave on schedule. He said he had his orders. The next morning, March 4th, 1918, the Cyclops weighed anchor and steamed out of Bridgetown Harbour. She passed the Triton at 10:15 a.m. She sent no distress signal. She filed no position report. She simply sailed north, into the blue Atlantic, and she was never seen again. The Navy did not begin to worry until March 13th. The Cyclops had been scheduled to arrive in Baltimore on March 6th or 7th, depending on weather and sea conditions. When she failed to appear, the initial assumption was that she had been delayed. Engine trouble, perhaps, or heavy seas, or an unscheduled stop at another port. The war was on, after all. Ships did not always keep to their schedules. Signals were missed, reports were filed late. But by March 13th, a full week had passed with no word. The Navy began sending wireless messages to every station along the Atlantic coast, asking if anyone had seen the Cyclops, heard from her, received any communication at all. The responses came back one after another with the same answer: no. On March 14th, the Navy launched a formal search. Every available ship in the 3rd Naval District was ordered to patrol the waters between Barbados and the Virginia Capes, looking for wreckage, survivors, any sign of what had become of the missing collier. Aircraft flew over the likely routes. Submarine chasers combed the shipping lanes. Destroyers swept the seas in widening arcs, their lookouts scanning the horizon for debris. They found nothing. On April 15th, the Navy officially declared the Cyclops lost with all hands. The families were notified by telegram. The 306 names were added to the rolls of the dead, and the investigation began. The first Board of Inquiry convened in May 1918, in the offices of the Bureau of Navigation in Washington, D.C. The officers assigned to the investigation were thorough, methodical, and increasingly baffled. They interviewed every witness who had seen the Cyclops in Barbados. They reviewed the ship's logs and manifests from her previous voyages. They examined the inspection records from her last overhaul, and they found, almost immediately, that something was very wrong. The inspection records were incomplete. Several of the mandated safety inspections had not been performed, or had been performed perfunctorily, or had been signed off by officers who had no memory of conducting them. The ship's stability calculations, the mathematical formulas that determined how much cargo she could safely carry, were missing entirely. The board asked the Bureau of Construction and Repair for the Cyclops' design specifications. They asked for the results of her sea trials. They asked for the engineering reports that should have been filed after every major voyage. The Bureau could not produce them. The records, they said, had been lost, or misfiled, or never created in the first place. The board turned its attention to Captain Worley. The rumours about Worley's loyalty had already begun to circulate in the press. The American public, inflamed by war propaganda, was in no mood to give the benefit of the doubt to a German-born captain who had vanished with 306 American lives. Newspapers ran stories suggesting that Worley had defected, that he had sailed the Cyclops to a German port, that the ship and her crew had been handed over to the Kaiser. The Navy investigated. They found no evidence to support the theory. German records examined after the war showed no trace of the Cyclops. No German submarine had reported sinking her. No German port had reported receiving her. If Worley had been a spy, he had been the most incompetent spy in history, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind no intelligence, no communication, no benefit to the enemy whatsoever. But the rumours persisted. They persist in certain corners of the internet to this day. The board's final report, issued in the summer of 1918, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. It noted that the Cyclops had been overloaded. It noted that her engine had been malfunctioning. It noted that the weather along the route had been, at times, severe. But it could not determine which of these factors, if any, had caused the ship to sink. It could not even determine with certainty that the ship had sunk at all. The final line read, "The disappearance of this ship has been one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy, all attempts to locate her having proved unsuccessful. Cause unknown." The families did not accept this. They could not accept it. In Baltimore, in Norfolk, in Philadelphia and New York and the small towns of the Chesapeake, the wives and mothers and children of the Cyclops' crew waited for news that never came. They wrote letters to the Navy demanding answers. They wrote letters to their congressmen demanding investigations. They wrote letters to each other, sharing scraps of information, clinging to the hope that somewhere, somehow, their husbands and fathers and sons were still alive. One of these families was the Nerio family of Washington, D.C. Their son, Seaman Second Class Manuel Nereo, had been 22 years old when the Cyclops sailed from Barbados. He had enlisted in the Navy 6 months earlier, eager to serve his country, eager to see the world beyond the neighbourhood where he had grown up. His mother, Maria, had seen him off at the train station, pressing a small silver crucifix into his hand and making him promise to write. He had written 3 times from Rio de Janeiro. He had written once from Bahia. He had written nothing from Barbados, but the mail was slow, and Maria had not worried. She would never stop waiting for that 4th letter. In the years that followed, Maria Nereo became one of the most persistent advocates for the families of the Cyclops. She wrote to the Navy every month asking if there was any news, any development, any possibility that her son had somehow survived. She received, in return, form letters. She received condolences. She received once a small package containing Manuel's personal effects, a razor, a comb, a photograph of herself, which had been found in his locker at the naval station where he had trained. She never received an answer. Maria Nereo died in 1951, at the age of 78. She had spent 33 years waiting. The Navy, for its part, did not forget the Cyclops. It could not forget. The loss was too large, too public, too embarrassing to ignore. But the institution's memory was selective, shaped by the pressures of war and the passage of time and the simple human desire to move on from things that could not be explained. In the 1920s, a second board of inquiry was convened, prompted by new theories about what might have happened. Some researchers had suggested that the Cyclops had been struck by a sudden storm, a squall so violent that it had capsized the ship before any distress signal could be sent. Others had proposed that the manganese ore had shifted in the holds, destabilizing the vessel and sending her to the bottom in minutes. The second board examined these theories. It found them plausible. It also found them unprovable. The weather records from March 1918 were incomplete. The ship's cargo had been loaded by Brazilian stevedores whose records had been lost. The engineering calculations that might have shown whether the ore could have shifted were, like so many other documents related to the Cyclops, simply not available. The second board issued its report in 1924. The final line was unchanged: cause unknown. The passage of years did not bring clarity. It brought instead the slow accumulation of absence. The widows who remarried and then grew old, the children who became adults without ever knowing their fathers, the graves that were marked with names but held no bodies. In the Fairview Lawn Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the victims of the Titanic rest beneath rows of identical grey headstones, there is at least the comfort of a place. The bodies were recovered. They were buried. The mourners could stand at the grave and know that someone they loved was beneath the earth. The families of the Cyclops had no such comfort. The Atlantic does not normally return what it has taken, and in this case, it returned nothing at all. No bodies washed ashore in the months after the disappearance. No wreckage appeared on the beaches of the Outer Banks or the coasts of Bermuda. No life ring, no deck chair, no scrap of paper with a name scrawled on it. The ship had simply vanished, and the sea had closed over the wound as though it had never been opened. For the families, this absence was its own kind of torment. Without a body, without a grave, without any physical evidence that death had occurred, the mind finds it impossible to stop hoping. Maria Nereo was not unusual in her persistence. Dozens of other families spent years writing letters, filing inquiries, chasing rumours that a survivor had been seen in some distant port, that a message in a bottle had washed up on some forgotten beach, that somewhere, somehow, the men of the Cyclops were still alive. They were not. The Navy knew they were not. The Navy had declared them dead in April 1918, and the Navy had no reason to revise that declaration. But for the families, the lack of proof was an open wound that never healed. It is one thing to grieve a death. It is another thing entirely to grieve a disappearance. To spend decades looking at the door and wondering if it might still open. To scan every crowd for a face that will never appear. To lie awake at night asking questions that have no answers. The war ended in November 1918, 8 months after the Cyclops vanished. The armistice brought celebrations in the streets, parades, the slow return of the soldiers and sailors who had survived the trenches and the U-boats, and the influenza that killed more men than the guns. For most Americans, the war was over. The sacrifices had been made. It was time to move on. But for the families of the Cyclops, there was no moving on. There was only the silence. The vast, indifferent silence of the sea, broken only by the occasional article in a newspaper, the occasional letter from the Navy, the occasional whisper of a new theory that, like all the others, led nowhere. In 1920, a salvage company claimed to have located the wreck of the Cyclops on the seafloor off the coast of Virginia. The Navy investigated. The claim was false. The salvage company had mistaken the wreck of another vessel for the missing collier. In 1924, a man in Mexico City claimed to have been a crewman aboard the Cyclops, to have survived the sinking, to have been held prisoner by German agents for 6 years before escaping. The Navy investigated. The man's story did not hold up. He had never served in the Navy. He had never been to sea. He was a fraud. In 1927, a medium in New York claimed to have contacted the spirit of Captain Worley, who revealed that the ship had been sunk by a German submarine operating in secret. The Navy did not investigate. There was, by that point, nothing left to investigate. The years passed. The witnesses aged and died. The files were boxed and stored and eventually transferred to the National Archives, where they sat unread for decades, the paper yellowing, the ink fading, the secrets, if there were any secrets, slowly vanishing into silence. And then, in 1941, it happened again. The Proteus and the Nereus were the Cyclops' sister ships, identical in design, built in the same Philadelphia shipyard, launched within months of each other in 1911 and 1913. They had spent their careers doing the same unglamorous work, hauling coal, resupplying the fleet, making the long runs to the Caribbean and back. They had survived the First World War without incident. They had been decommissioned, then recommissioned, then sold to a Canadian shipping company when the Navy no longer needed them. In the fall of 1941, with another war approaching, the Proteus and the Nereus were pressed back into service. The British war effort was desperate for raw materials, and both ships were loaded with the same cargo the Cyclops had carried 23 years earlier, manganese ore, thousands of tons of it, bound for the steel mills of the United Kingdom. The Proteus left St. Thomas in the US Virgin Islands on November 23, 1941. She was carrying 2,000 tons of bauxite ore and a crew of 58 men. She was bound for Norfolk, Virginia. She never arrived. The Nereus left St. Thomas 2 weeks later, on December the 10th, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, 3 days after the United States entered the Second World War. She was carrying a similar cargo, a similar crew. She was following the same route. She too vanished without a trace. No distress signals, no wreckage, no survivors. The sea had taken 3 sister ships on the same route, carrying the same cargo, and it had returned nothing. The loss of the Proteus and the Nereus should have been front-page news. In any other moment it would have been. But the attack on Pearl Harbor had plunged the nation into war, and the disappearance of 2 aging cargo ships was swallowed by the larger catastrophe. The newspapers barely mentioned it. The Navy filed the losses and moved on to more pressing matters. But for the researchers who would later study the Cyclops, the loss of her sister ships was the most important clue of all. 3 identical vessels, 3 identical disappearances, 3 cargoes of heavy ore. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Whatever had happened to the Cyclops, it seemed, had happened to the Proteus and the Nereus as well. The same flaw in design, or the same instability under load, or the same vulnerability to the particular conditions of that route. The most widely accepted theory, among those who have studied the disappearances, is that all 3 ships were victims of structural failure. Manganese ore is one of the densest cargoes in the world, far denser than the coal these ships were designed to carry. If the ore shifted during heavy seas, even slightly, it could destabilize the vessel in seconds. The hull, already stressed by the weight of the cargo, could buckle. the ship could roll, and because there was no time to send a distress signal, no time to launch lifeboats, no time to do anything but die, the crew would go down with the ship, and the sea would close over them, and nothing would remain. This theory explains the absence of wreckage. A ship that sinks in deep water, intact, leaves little trace on the surface. The debris field is thousands of feet below, scattered across the seafloor, covered in sediment, invisible to any search conducted from above. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain why the Cyclops' inspection records were missing. It does not explain why the Navy's investigation was so cursory, so incomplete, so willing to accept cause unknown as a final answer. It does not explain why, more than a century later, no one has ever found the wreck. The families continued to ask. The Navy continued to answer with silence. In the 1960s, the Cyclops became entangled in the mythology of the Bermuda Triangle, that loose collection of disappearances and mysteries that popular writers have used to sell books and television specials for half a century. The ship was presented as evidence of something supernatural, something unexplainable, something that transcended the ordinary dangers of the sea. This was and is nonsense. The Bermuda Triangle is not a place where ships disappear at unusual rates. The waters between Florida, Bermuda and Puerto Rico are among the most heavily trafficked in the world, and the percentage of vessels lost there is no higher than in any other comparably busy stretch of ocean. The Cyclops did not vanish because of aliens or sea monsters or interdimensional portals. She vanished because something went wrong, something mechanical, something structural, something human, and because the sea does not explain itself. But the Bermuda Triangle mythology did one useful thing. It kept the Cyclops in the public memory. People who would never have heard of a World War I collier knew the name of the ship, knew that she had disappeared, knew that no one had ever found out why. And some of those people, amateur historians, professional researchers, obsessive enthusiasts, decided to look for answers. The search for the Cyclops has continued intermittently for more than 100 years. Expeditions have scoured the seafloor off the coast of Virginia, off the coast of Maryland, off the coast of North Carolina. Researchers have examined declassified German naval records, looking for any mention of a submarine attack. Archivists have combed through the Navy's files, looking for the missing inspection reports, the missing stability calculations, the missing evidence that might finally explain what happened. They have found nothing. The wreck of the Cyclops has never been located. The records that might explain her fate have never surfaced. The questions that the families asked in 1918 remain unanswered in 2024. But the absence of answers is not the same as the absence of evidence. There are things we know, facts, documented, verifiable, that narrow the possibilities, that point towards certain explanations and away from others. There are witnesses who saw the ship in Barbados, who spoke to the captain, who noticed the way she sat in the water. There are engineering calculations that can be reconstructed, stability analyses that can be run, hypotheses that can be tested against the physical constraints of a 542-foot collier carrying 11,000 tons of ore. And there are stories, human stories, small and specific and heartbreaking, that deserve to be told. The sailors who left letters behind, the officers who filed complaints that were ignored, the captain who may have been a traitor, or may have been a victim, or may simply have been a man overwhelmed by a command he could not control. The Cyclops took 306 men into the silence. The least we can do is pull some of them back into the light. To understand what happened aboard the Cyclops in those final days, we need to understand the men who sailed her, not as numbers on a casualty list, but as individuals, with names, with histories, with families who loved them, and futures that were stolen. The crew was a cross-section of the American Navy in 1918. There were career sailors, men who had spent decades at sea, who knew the rhythms of a ship the way a farmer knows the rhythms of the land. There were new recruits, boys from the cities and the farms, who had enlisted for the adventure or the steady pay or the vague patriotism that the war posters kindled. There were Marines, assigned to shipboard duty, who would never fire a shot at the enemy. There were officers, some competent and some less so, who navigated the peculiar hierarchy of a military vessel in wartime. And there was the cargo, 11,000 tons of manganese ore, loaded in the holds of a ship designed for 10,500. It sat there in the darkness below the waterline, dense and heavy and silent, pressing against the steel plates of the hull, shifting imperceptibly with every roll of the sea. The Cyclops had made this run before. She had carried heavy cargoes before. She had sailed through storms before. But this voyage was different, and the men aboard her knew it was different, even if they could not have articulated why. Something was wrong with the ship. Something was wrong with the captain. Something was wrong with the silence that would soon swallow them all. The first sign that something was wrong came before the Cyclops even left Barbados. She arrived at Bridgetown on March 3, 1918, having crossed from Rio de Janeiro with her holds full of manganese ore destined for the steel mills of Baltimore. The voyage north from Brazil had been uneventful, or at least uneventful enough that no one thought to document anything unusual. But when the Cyclops dropped anchor in Carlisle Bay, the men ashore noticed something immediately. She was sitting wrong in the water. A ship has a waterline, a painted stripe along the hull that marks where the surface of the sea should meet the steel when the vessel is properly loaded. Every sailor knows to look at that line when a ship enters port. It tells you, at a glance, whether the cargo is balanced, whether the ballast is right, whether the vessel is riding as her designers intended. The Cyclops' waterline was wrong. She was riding low, lower than she should have been, lower than the harbour pilots had ever seen her ride before. Her deck was closer to the waves than it ought to have been. Her freeboard, the distance between the waterline and the main deck, was visibly reduced. In the language of naval architecture, she was overloaded. The American consul in Barbados, a man named Brockhurst Livingston, noticed it. The British harbour officials noticed it. The stevedores who came alongside to help with resupply noticed it. Everyone who looked at the Cyclops as she swung at anchor in the Caribbean sunshine could see that something was not right with the way she sat in the water. But no one stopped her from sailing. This is the first of the silences that will haunt this story. The bureaucratic silence, the institutional silence, the silence of men who saw something wrong and chose not to act. Livingston would later testify that he had concerns about the ship's condition. The harbour officials would later acknowledge that she appeared overloaded. But in March of 1918, with a war on, with manganese desperately needed for the production of steel, with every collier in the fleet running at maximum capacity, no one was inclined to delay a Navy ship over a visual impression of improper loading. The Cyclops was cleared for departure. She would sail on March 4th, the day after she arrived, bound for Baltimore with a brief coaling stop planned at a point that remains unclear in the historical record. Some accounts say she intended to stop in Norfolk. Some say Hampton Roads. Some say she planned to sail directly through, refueling from her own bunkers. The confusion is itself significant. It suggests that the ship's intended route was either poorly communicated or subsequently obscured. What is certain is that she left Barbados on the morning of March 4th, 1918, with 306 souls aboard and approximately 11,000 tons of manganese ore in her holds. She was never seen again. The manganese is important. You cannot understand what likely happened to the Cyclops without understanding what she was carrying and why it mattered. Manganese is a metal, greyish-white, brittle, essential. In 1918, it had one primary industrial use that mattered to the war effort. It was an alloy component in the production of steel. Without manganese, you cannot make the kind of hardened steel needed for artillery shells, for armour plate, for the machinery of modern warfare. A nation fighting a world war needs manganese the way a body needs blood. Run short of it and everything stops. The problem for the United States was that manganese ore is not evenly distributed across the Earth's surface. The richest deposits in the Western Hemisphere were in Brazil, thousands of miles from the steel mills of Pittsburgh and Baltimore and Birmingham. Getting that ore from the mines of Minas Gerais to the furnaces of Pennsylvania required a fleet of cargo ships running continuously across the Atlantic, through waters patrolled by German submarines, in a race against the industrial demands of total war. The Cyclops was part of that fleet. She had been requisitioned by the Navy specifically for this purpose, to carry heavy bulk cargo, to make the Brazil to Baltimore run, to keep the manganese flowing. She was one of 4 sister ships, all nearly identical, all built by the William Cramp & Sons shipyard in Philadelphia between 1910 and 1911. The Jupiter, the Neptune, the Proteus, the Cyclops. 4 colliers, each 542 feet long, each capable of carrying approximately 10,500 tons of cargo in their cavernous holds. 10,500 tons. That was the designed capacity. That was the number the naval architects had calculated when they drew the plans, the number that took into account the ship's structural strength, her stability characteristics, her ability to right herself if she rolled too far in heavy seas. Load her to 10,500 tons, and she would sit properly in the water with adequate freeboard, with sufficient reserve buoyancy, with the margin of safety that separated a working cargo ship from a floating coffin. The Cyclops left Barbados with 11,000 tons of manganese ore in her holds, 500 tons over her designed capacity. It does not sound like much. A rounding error, a minor overload, the kind of thing that happens all the time in the pragmatic world of wartime shipping. But 500 tons of manganese ore is not like 500 tons of cotton, or 500 tons of grain. Manganese ore is dense. It is heavy in a way that reshapes the physics of a ship. A load of grain sits high in the holds, filling the space with relatively light material. The ship rides easily. She has what naval architects call a comfortable motion, rolling gently, recovering slowly, giving her crew time to brace themselves against the movements of the sea. A load of manganese ore sits low. It concentrates mass at the bottom of the ship, pulling the centre of gravity down, making the vessel stiff, quick to roll, quick to recover, snapping back and forth in a motion that is exhausting for the crew and stressful for the hull. A stiff ship is not inherently dangerous. Many vessels are designed to carry dense cargo and are engineered to handle the resulting motion. But a stiff ship that is also overloaded is a different matter. The mathematics of stability become unforgiving. The reserve buoyancy, the ship's ability to rise back up when a wave pushes her down, decreases. The freeboard shrinks. The margin between a ship that rides out a storm and a ship that founders in one becomes narrower, and if something shifts, if the cargo moves, if the oar slides to one side of the hold, the consequences can be catastrophic. This brings us to the first of the theories that have been advanced to explain the loss of the Cyclops: structural failure and capsizing due to cargo shift. The scenario goes like this. The Cyclops leaves Barbados overloaded, her holds packed with manganese ore, her waterline submerged beyond its proper mark. She sails north into the Atlantic, heading for the coast of Virginia. Somewhere along the way she encounters heavy weather. Not necessarily a hurricane, not necessarily a once-in-a-century storm, just the ordinary rough seas that the Atlantic produces regularly in early March. The ship begins to roll. The motion is violent, stiff, exhausting. And somewhere in the holds the ore begins to move. Manganese ore is not a liquid, but it does not behave like a solid either. Under the right conditions, the right combination of moisture, content, vibration and inclination, it can flow, it can shift, it can slide from one side of the hull to the other, piling up against the hull plates, creating an imbalance that the ship cannot correct. When cargo shifts like this, the ship develops a list. She tips to one side and cannot right herself. The list reduces her stability further. Water begins to come over the low side of the deck. The holds, already full, begin to flood. The weight of the water compounds the weight of the shifted ore. The list increases. More water comes aboard. The cycle accelerates. It can happen with terrifying speed. A ship that was fighting the seas one moment can be lying on her beam ends the next, her deck vertical, her crew scrambling for handholds that no longer exist. And then she goes over. She capsizes. She sinks. If this is what happened to the Cyclops, it would explain the absence of a distress call. The ship's radio, in 1918, was not the instantaneous system we know today. It required time to key a message, time to transmit, time for the operator to reach the radio room and begin broadcasting. A ship that capsized suddenly might not have had time to send anything at all. The men aboard would have had seconds, not minutes. They would have been thrown from their bunks, hurled across compartments, trapped in spaces that were suddenly filling with water. The lights would have gone out, the darkness would have been absolute, and then the sea would have taken them. This theory is plausible. It is consistent with the observed overloading. It is consistent with the known characteristics of manganese ore. It is consistent with the silence, the total, absolute silence, that followed the ship's departure from Barbados. But it is not proven, and there are problems with it. The most significant problem is that the Cyclops had carried heavy cargoes before. She had made the Brazil to Baltimore run multiple times. Her crew knew how to handle dense cargo, knew how to trim the holds, knew how to watch for the signs of shifting. They were not amateurs. They were not sailing blind. If the ore was improperly loaded, someone aboard should have noticed. Someone should have said something. Someone should have filed a report, unless of course they did, and the reports were lost. This brings us to the second silence, the missing records. When the Navy convened its board of inquiry into the loss of the Cyclops, the investigators expected to find a paper trail. Ships like the Cyclops generated documentation constantly: inspection reports, stability calculations, cargo manifests, engineering logs, maintenance records. Every repair, every loading operation, every mechanical problem should have been documented somewhere. The investigators needed those records to understand what condition the ship was in when she sailed, what problems had been identified, what warnings had been raised. They found almost nothing. The inspection reports from the Cyclops' last survey were missing. The stability calculations that should have accompanied her loading plan were missing. The engineering assessments of her propulsion system, assessments that should have been conducted regularly, that should have been filed with the Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair, were missing. It was as if someone had reached into the files and removed everything that might explain what happened. The Navy searched. The investigators sent requests to every office that might have copies. They interviewed clerks and filing officers and administrative personnel. They traced the paper trail backward, looking for duplicates, looking for references, looking for anything that might survive. They found fragments, mentions in other documents, cross-references that pointed to reports that no longer existed, but the reports themselves were gone. This absence has fueled speculation for more than a century. Some researchers believe the records were lost through ordinary bureaucratic incompetence, misfiled, discarded, destroyed in one of the many fires or floods or moves that have claimed Navy paperwork over the decades. Some believe they were deliberately removed, either to cover up negligence on the part of naval officials or to conceal information that the government did not want made public. And some believe there was nothing to conceal at all, that the records simply never existed, that the inspections were never conducted, that the Cyclops was allowed to sail without the documentation that should have been required. If this last explanation is true, it would mean that the Navy sent 306 men to sea on a ship that had not been properly inspected, carrying a cargo that had not been properly calculated, under conditions that no one had bothered to verify. It would mean that the silence that swallowed the Cyclops began not in the Atlantic but in the filing cabinets of Washington. A silence of indifference, of corners cut, of bureaucratic negligence in the service of wartime haste. The families of the lost men asked about this. They wrote letters to the Navy demanding to know why the records were missing, demanding to know who was responsible, demanding accountability. Their letters were answered with platitudes and deflections. The records could not be found. The matter was under investigation. The Navy regretted that it could not provide more information at this time. 100 years later, the records are still missing. The matter is still, in some sense, under investigation. The Navy still regrets that it cannot provide more information. But structural failure is not the only possibility. The Cyclops disappeared during a war, and war brings its own set of explanations. In March of 1918, German submarines were hunting in the waters of the Atlantic. The U-boat campaign was at its height. Merchant ships and naval auxiliaries were being sunk with regularity, often without warning, often without survivors. A ship the size of the Cyclops would have been a valuable target, a blow against American industrial capacity, a victory for the German war effort, a propaganda coup. The theory that the Cyclops was torpedoed by a German submarine has circulated since the moment she disappeared. It was, in some ways, the most natural explanation. The ship vanished in wartime. The enemy had submarines in the area. The conclusion seemed obvious. But when investigators examined the German naval records after the war, records that were captured and declassified, records that documented every submarine patrol, every torpedo fired, every ship claimed sunk, they found nothing. No German submarine reported attacking a vessel matching the Cyclops' description. No U-boat was operating in the area where the ship was believed to have disappeared. No claim of sinking was ever filed. This does not definitively rule out a submarine attack. Records can be incomplete. Submarines can misidentify targets. A U-boat might have sunk the Cyclops without realizing what she was, without bothering to report it, without leaving any trace in the surviving documentation. But it makes the theory less likely. The Germans were meticulous record keepers, especially when it came to their submarine successes. A kill as significant as a 6,000-ton American naval collier would normally have been documented, celebrated, propagandized. There is another problem with the submarine theory: the completeness of the disappearance. Ships that are torpedoed usually leave something behind: debris, oil slicks, bodies, lifeboats, survivors clinging to wreckage. The Atlantic is vast, but it is not a perfect void. A ship that goes down violently, that breaks apart, that spills her contents into the sea, leaves traces that can be found. The Cyclops left nothing. No wreckage was ever recovered, no bodies were ever found, no oil slicks were reported, no lifeboats, no life jackets, no floating debris of any kind. It was as if the ship had been erased from existence, not sunk but simply removed, taken whole into the deep without leaving a single splinter behind. This completeness points away from a torpedo attack and towards something else: a sudden total loss of hull integrity. Not an explosion from outside, but a failure from within. A structural collapse so catastrophic that the ship went down in seconds, taking everything with her, leaving nothing to float back to the surface. And this brings us to the engine. The Cyclops was powered by 2 steam engines, fed by coal-fired boilers, turning a single propeller shaft. It was a propulsion system typical of the era, reliable, proven, understood. But in the months before her final voyage, the Cyclops had been experiencing problems, specifically problems with her starboard engine. We know this because of the reports that do survive: fragmentary, incomplete, but consistent. The starboard engine had cracked a cylinder. Repairs had been attempted in Rio de Janeiro. The repairs were not fully successful. When the Cyclops left Brazil, she was operating on reduced power, running primarily on her port engine, nursing the damaged starboard machinery along as best she could. This was not by itself fatal. Ships operate on reduced power all the time. A damaged engine can be nursed, can be babied, can be kept running at reduced output until proper repairs can be made in port. The Cyclops had 2 engines. She could make way on one. The captain knew about the problem. The chief engineer knew about the problem. They made the calculation that wartime sailors were forced to make every day. Better to sail damaged than not to sail at all. But a damaged engine creates complications. It reduces the ship's speed, which increases the time she spends at sea, which increases her exposure to weather and enemy action. It reduces her maneuverability, which makes it harder to respond to emergencies, harder to avoid hazards, harder to adjust course when conditions change. And it creates asymmetric thrust, which affects the ship's handling, which can compound other problems if those problems arise. If the Cyclops encountered heavy weather with one engine partially disabled, she would have been less able to hold her heading, less able to turn into the waves, less able to execute the maneuvers that an experienced captain uses to ride out a storm. She would have been more vulnerable than she should have been, more exposed, more likely to find herself in a situation that a fully operational ship might have survived. We do not know if this vulnerability contributed to her loss. We do not know if the engine failed completely at some critical moment. We do not know if the asymmetric thrust put her beam onto a wave she could not escape. We know only that she left Barbados with a problem and that she never arrived anywhere and that no one ever heard from her again. The silence swallowed everything: the ship, the crew, the explanation. But there is one more thread to pull before we can understand the full mystery of the Cyclops, and it is the strangest thread of all. It concerns the captain. George Witchman Worley was not the kind of man the United States Navy typically appointed to command its ships. He was 51 years old in 1918, a naturalized citizen who had been born in Germany. He had spent most of his career in the merchant marine, rising through the ranks of civilian shipping before being commissioned as a lieutenant commander in the Naval Reserve. He came to the Cyclops not through the normal channels of naval advancement, but through the exigencies of war. The Navy needed experienced ship handlers, and Worley was available. He was, by all accounts, a difficult man. The testimony that survives paints a picture of a commander who ruled his ship through intimidation rather than competence. He was quarrelsome, he was abusive, he was given to fits of rage that terrified his crew and alienated his officers. He appeared on the bridge at odd hours, sometimes in his pajamas, sometimes carrying a weapon. He threatened sailors with violence. He played favourites with certain members of the crew while brutalising others. He was, in the language of the era, eccentric, a word that covered a multitude of behaviours that would today be recognised as signs of serious psychological instability. His officers despised him. Several had filed formal complaints about his conduct, complaints that had wound their way through the Navy's bureaucracy without result. His executive officer, a lieutenant named Forbes, had reportedly threatened to bring charges against him when they reached port. The relationship between the captain and his senior officers was so poisoned that some researchers have wondered whether there might have been a confrontation aboard, whether the tension might have erupted into something that contributed to the ship's loss. But the strangest thing about George Worley was not his temperament, it was his name. George Worley was not born George Worley. He was born Johann Friedrich Wichmann in Germany in 1866. He emigrated to the United States as a young man and at some point changed his name completely, not just anglicising it, as many German immigrants did, but replacing it entirely. Johann Friedrich Wichmann became George Wichmann Worley. The transformation was so complete that the Navy did not discover his original identity until after his death. In 1918, with the United States at war with Germany, with anti-German hysteria sweeping the country, with German Americans being persecuted and German sympathisers being arrested, the fact that the captain of a missing naval vessel had been born in Germany and had changed his name to conceal it was explosive. It was the kind of fact that invited speculation. It was the kind of fact that made people wonder, had Worley betrayed his ship? The accusation emerged almost before the debris search had ended. In the newspapers, in the Navy Department's hallways, in the whispered conversations of grieving families, the question took shape. Did George Worley deliver his ship to the Kaiser? It was not an unreasonable question, given what was known. A German-born captain. A name change that looked, in retrospect, like concealment. A ship carrying war-critical cargo. A disappearance so complete that it seemed almost designed, as if someone had wanted the Cyclops to vanish without a trace. The theory wrote itself. Worley had sailed his ship to a prearranged rendezvous with a German submarine or surface raider. He had handed over the manganese ore, the crew, everything. He had defected to the country of his birth, betraying the nation that had adopted him. The theory had the appeal of all conspiracy theories. It explained the inexplicable, it provided a villain, it transformed a senseless tragedy into a comprehensible betrayal. And in the atmosphere of 1918, with German agents supposedly lurking behind every corner, with the Zimmermann telegram still fresh in memory, with the country gripped by the kind of paranoid nationalism that accompanies all great wars, the theory found believers. But here is what the theory could not explain. No German submarine or surface raider ever reported capturing or sinking the USS Cyclops. After the war, when the German naval records were captured and examined, when every U-boat log and every commerce raider's manifest was scrutinised for evidence of the Cyclops' fate, there was nothing. The Germans kept meticulous records. They were proud of their kills. They had no reason, after the war, to conceal a success. If a U-boat had sunk the Cyclops, the captain would have logged it. If a raider had captured her, the prize would have been recorded. The silence in the German archives was as complete as the silence on the sea. More than that, the logistics made no sense. The Cyclops vanished somewhere in the Western Atlantic, in waters that German submarines rarely penetrated. The U-boats of 1918 were not the long-range vessels of the Second World War. They operated primarily in the Eastern Atlantic, in the approaches to Britain, where the convoy routes concentrated their targets. A U-boat in the waters between Barbados and Baltimore would have been far from its supply lines, operating at the extreme edge of its range. It was possible, but it was not likely. And if a U-boat had found the Cyclops, it would almost certainly have torpedoed her rather than captured her. A collier was not worth the risk of a boarding action. The oar was useful, but not useful enough to justify the exposure. The standard practice was to sink merchant vessels with torpedoes or deck guns, take a few prisoners for intelligence purposes and move on. A captured Cyclops would have been a liability, not an asset. And then there was the matter of the crew. 306 men sailed on the Cyclops. If Worley had betrayed the ship, what happened to them? Did they all cooperate in their own capture? Did they resist? Were they killed? The scenario required either a mass defection, hundreds of American sailors voluntarily surrendering to the enemy, or a mass murder so complete that no body, no lifeboat, no piece of wreckage ever washed ashore. Neither seemed plausible. The crew of the Cyclops included men from across the country, men with families waiting for them, men with no conceivable loyalty to Germany. The consul general they had picked up in Rio, Alfred Gottschalk, was himself under investigation for espionage. But even if Gottschalk had been a German agent, even if Worley had been working with him, the mechanics of capturing or killing 300 American sailors without a single witness, a single survivor, a single piece of evidence remained impossible to explain. The Navy investigated the espionage theory. They investigated it thoroughly. They examined Worley's background, his finances, his associations. They interviewed everyone who had known him. They found a difficult man, a disturbed man, a man whose behaviour was erratic and whose judgment was questionable. They did not find a traitor. What they found instead was something sadder and more ordinary. A man who had fled his homeland as a young immigrant and had tried to become American, who had changed his name not to facilitate espionage, but to escape the stigma that attached to German Americans in an era of nativist hostility. Johann Friedrich Wichmann had become George Worley because George Worley could rise in American shipping while Johann Wichmann could not. The name change was not a cover for treason. It was a cover for origin. It was the same quiet erasure that thousands of German and Irish and Italian immigrants had performed in the decades before and after. The shedding of an old identity in pursuit of a new one. The tragedy of George Worley was not that he betrayed America. It was that America, in the end, suspected him of betrayal simply because of where he had been born. The espionage theory collapsed under the weight of its own implausibility. But it never entirely disappeared. It lingers in the secondary literature, in the more sensational accounts of the Cyclops mystery, in the corners of the internet where mysteries attract speculation. It is the theory that refuses to die, because it answers a need that the truth cannot satisfy. The truth, that we do not know what happened, is unbearable. A betrayal at least would be comprehensible. But the Navy concluded what the evidence demanded. There was no proof that George Worley had betrayed his ship, no proof that the Germans had captured or sunk her, no proof of anything except absence. The Cyclops had sailed into the Atlantic and had ceased to exist. Everything else was conjecture. And yet the investigation did not end there, because even if Worley had not deliberately delivered his ship to the enemy, the question of his competence remained. The Navy wanted to know, had his erratic behaviour contributed to the loss? Had his conflicts with his officers created a dysfunction aboard that impaired the ship's ability to respond to a crisis? Had the man himself been a danger to his command? The testimony from survivors of earlier voyages painted a damning picture. Worley had once chased a sailor around the deck with a pistol. He had appeared on the bridge in states of undress that suggested he had been drinking or was otherwise impaired. He had made decisions that his officers found inexplicable, routing the ship through waters they considered dangerous, ignoring weather warnings they thought prudent to heed. His executive officer, Forbes, had apparently compiled a dossier of complaints that he intended to present to the Navy when they reached Baltimore. That dossier, whatever it contained, went down with the ship. There were rumours, never confirmed, impossible now to verify, that some of the officers had discussed relieving Worley of command. This would have been an extraordinary step, the kind of mutiny that ended careers and invited courts-martial. But the situation aboard the Cyclops had apparently deteriorated to the point where it was at least being discussed. The ship was not a happy ship. The captain was not a stable captain. And somewhere in the Atlantic, in circumstances we will never know, something happened that killed everyone aboard. Did Worley's instability play a role? Did his judgment fail at a critical moment? Did he refuse to take an action that might have saved the ship, or take an action that doomed her? We cannot know. The only witnesses are dead, and the sea does not testify. What we can say is this: George Wichmann Worley was a man who had spent his life trying to outrun his origins, and in the end his origins caught up with him anyway. Not because they caused the disaster, there is no evidence of that, but because they shaped how the disaster was interpreted, how his memory was treated, how his story was told. He became the traitor captain, the German spy, the man who sold his ship. The accusation followed his name into history even after the investigation cleared him. It was easier to believe in a villain than to accept the void. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of the Cyclops mystery, that a man who may have done nothing wrong, who may have simply been unlucky, who may have been struggling with demons we cannot diagnose and pressures we cannot imagine, has been cast as the architect of his own destruction. The families of the 306 men who died with him have had to live not only with their loss, but with the whisper that their husbands and fathers and sons were betrayed by their captain. The whisper has no evidence behind it, but whispers do not need evidence, they need only repetition. The Navy closed the espionage file, the boards of inquiry moved on to other theories, and George Worley's name settled into the ambiguous space where it remains today. Not quite exonerated, not quite condemned, forever shadowed by a suspicion that says more about the fears of 1918 than about the man himself. But the Cyclops did not disappear alone. This is the part of the story that lifts the mystery out of the realm of the ordinary and into something stranger, something that has never been satisfactorily explained. Because the Cyclops had two sister ships, built to the same design, operated by the same Navy, carrying the same kinds of cargo, and both of them vanished. The USS Proteus was commissioned in 1913, the same year as the Cyclops. She was virtually identical to her sister, the same length, the same beam, the same carrying capacity, the same distinctive profile with the high sides and the derricks and the bridge perched forward. She served through the First World War without incident, carrying coal and supplies to the fleet, doing the unglamorous work that kept the Navy running. After the war, she was transferred to civilian service, leased to a commercial operator, but she remained a naval vessel, subject to naval oversight, crewed by naval reserves. In November 1941, with another war looming, the Proteus was pressed back into active service. She was loaded with bauxite ore, the raw material for aluminum, as essential to the war effort of 1941 as manganese had been in 1918, and dispatched from St. Thomas, in the Virgin Islands, to the mainland. She carried a crew of 58 men. She never arrived. Like the Cyclops, the Proteus vanished without a trace. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. The Navy searched, the Navy investigated, the Navy found nothing. The Proteus had sailed into the Atlantic and had ceased to exist, just as her sister had done 23 years before. And then, 1 month later, it happened again. The USS Nereus was the third ship of the class, the youngest of the three sisters. She had the same design, the same history of reliable if unglamorous service, the same post-war transfer to commercial operation and wartime recall. In December 1941, the same month that Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, the same month that the United States entered the Second World War, the Nereus was loaded with bauxite and dispatched from St. Thomas to Portland, Maine. She never arrived. The details were identical. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. The Nereus had followed her sisters into oblivion, vanishing on the same route, carrying the same kind of cargo, in the same waters where the Cyclops had disappeared a generation before. 3 ships, 3 disappearances, no evidence. The coincidence was staggering. The Navy examined every possibility. Sabotage. But there was no evidence, and the war had only just begun. German agents could not have infiltrated the ship so quickly. Submarine attack, but no U-boat reported sinking either vessel, and the German submarine campaign in the Western Atlantic had barely started in late 1941. Structural failure. But what kind of structural failure could have caused 3 ships of the same class to sink so quickly, so completely, that not a single piece of wreckage was ever found? The investigators returned inevitably to the design. Here was the uncomfortable truth. All 3 ships had been built by the same yard, to the same plans, with the same structural characteristics. If there was a flaw in the Cyclops, there was a flaw in the Proteus and the Nereus. If the Cyclops had been vulnerable to catastrophic failure under certain conditions, her sisters would have been equally vulnerable. The 3 disappearances were not independent events. They were, in some sense, the same event, repeated 3 times with different crews and different cargoes, but with the same fatal outcome. What was the flaw? The engineers pored over the blueprints, they examined the stress analysis, they consulted with the yard that had built the ships and with the naval architects who had designed them. They focused inevitably on the loading. All 3 ships had been carrying ore at the time of their disappearance. The Cyclops had been loaded with manganese. The Proteus and Nereus had been loaded with bauxite. Both cargoes were dense, heavy, concentrated. Both cargoes, if improperly loaded, could shift. And all 3 ships had been designed before the modern science of cargo management had fully developed. The theory that emerged, the theory that remains the most plausible explanation for all three disappearances, centers on a phenomenon called free surface effect. When a liquid cargo sloshes in a partially filled tank, it destabilizes the ship. The moving mass of fluid shifts the center of gravity with every roll, amplifying the motion instead of damping it. This is why modern tankers use baffles and subdivided compartments to prevent the cargo from moving as a single mass. But the free surface effect is not limited to liquids. A granular cargo, sand, ore, grain, can behave like a liquid under the right conditions. If the cargo is wet, if the ship is rolling heavily, if the individual particles are small enough, the mass can shift just like water, flowing from one side of the hull to the other with each roll. And once that shift begins, it is almost impossible to stop. The ship lists. The cargo flows toward the low side, the list increases. The cargo flows further. Within seconds, a manageable roll can become an unrecoverable capsize. The Cyclops, the Proteus, and the Nereus were all carrying dense granular cargoes. They were all operating in waters known for sudden squalls. They were all old ships built before the dangers of cargo shift were fully understood, and they all vanished without a trace, which is exactly what you would expect from a sudden capsize. There would be no time to send a distress signal. The ship would roll over in seconds, trapping everyone aboard. The heavy cargo would drag the hull to the bottom almost immediately. Whatever wreckage escaped would be scattered over miles of ocean, lost to the waves and the currents before any search could begin. It is a theory. It is only a theory. The Navy has never confirmed it. The official conclusion remains what it has always been: cause unknown. But the theory has the weight of physics behind it. It explains why 3 ships of the same class disappeared in the same way. It explains the completeness of the loss, the absence of survivors, the silence. And it carries its own kind of horror. Because if the theory is true, then the crews of the Cyclops, the Proteus, and the Nereus did not have time to react. They did not have time to launch lifeboats or send distress signals or don their life jackets. They were one moment aboard a functioning ship, and the next moment they were in the water in the dark as the hull rolled over them and the cargo carried them down. 306 men aboard the Cyclops, 58 aboard the Proteus, 61 aboard the Nereus, 425 human beings over a span of 23 years, all dead in the same way, all lost to the same design, all swallowed by the same silence. The Navy has never fully explained the disappearance of these 3 ships. The official position is that the cause is unknown and will likely remain unknown. The wrecks have never been found. The waters are deep, and the search area is vast, and the technology of underwater exploration, even today, has limits. Somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic, in the darkness where no light reaches, the hulls of the Cyclops, the Proteus, and the Nereus rest with their cargoes and their crews. We do not know exactly where. We do not know exactly how they came to be there, but we know that they are not coming back. The families of the lost sailors, the wives and children and parents who waited for ships that never arrived, never received bodies to bury. They never received explanations that satisfied. They received instead letters from the Navy Department expressing regret and uncertainty, and then, eventually, nothing. The war moved on. The world moved on. The names of the dead were carved into memorials and printed in casualty lists and gradually forgotten. Except they were not entirely forgotten. Because some of those families refused to accept the silence. They wrote letters. They filed petitions. They demanded answers from a government that had none to give. And for decades, the Navy Department received a steady stream of correspondence from people who could not let go, who could not accept that their husbands and sons and brothers had simply vanished into the Atlantic with no explanation, no wreckage, no graves. Consider Mrs. Ethel Martin of Baltimore, Maryland. Her husband, William Martin, was a coal passer aboard the Cyclops, one of the lowest-ranking men in the engine room, a man whose job was to shovel fuel into the boilers hour after hour in the heat and the darkness below decks. He was 31 years old when the ship sailed from Barbados. He left behind a wife and 2 young daughters, ages 4 and 7. When the Navy declared the Cyclops missing, Mrs. Martin received a telegram expressing the department's regret. When the Navy declared her husband presumed dead, she received a letter offering condolences. When she asked what had happened to her husband's ship, she received a response explaining that the cause of the loss was unknown. That was not enough for Ethel Martin. Over the next 15 years, she wrote to the Navy Department no fewer than 47 times. She wrote to the Secretary of the Navy. She wrote to the Bureau of Navigation. She wrote to congressmen and senators representing Maryland. She wrote to the White House. In each letter, she asked the same questions. What happened to the Cyclops? Has any new evidence been discovered? Have any witnesses come forward? Is there any possibility that her husband survived? The answers never changed. The Navy Department responded to each inquiry with polite, careful language, explaining that no new information had been obtained, that the official finding remained unchanged, that the cause of the loss was unknown and would likely remain so. They expressed sympathy for her suffering. They thanked her for her patience. They did not give her what she wanted, which was an explanation she could understand and accept. Mrs. Martin was not alone. Dozens of families kept writing, kept asking, kept demanding. Some of them formed informal networks, exchanging information and theories, comparing the responses they received from the government. They noticed inconsistencies. They noticed gaps. They noticed that certain questions were never answered, that certain records were never produced, that certain officials seemed reluctant to discuss the case at all. The families wanted to know why the Cyclops had been allowed to sail with a broken engine. They wanted to know why the ship had been loaded so heavily. They wanted to know who had made the decision to send Captain Worley, a man whose loyalty and competence had been questioned by his own officers, in command of a vessel carrying 300 lives and 11,000 tons of critical war material. They wanted to know what the Navy knew, and when it knew it, and why it would not share that knowledge with the people who had lost everything. These are reasonable questions. They deserved reasonable answers, but the families did not receive them. What they received, instead, was bureaucratic silence dressed in sympathy. Part of the problem was genuine uncertainty. The Navy truly did not know what had happened to the Cyclops. The ship had vanished without a trace, and no amount of investigation could conjure evidence from the empty sea. The boards of inquiry had examined every available witness, reviewed every available document, considered every plausible theory, and concluded that the cause was unknown. This was not evasion, it was honesty. The Navy did not have answers because there were no answers to be had. But part of the problem was something else. Part of the problem was that the Navy did not want to admit what the record strongly suggested, that the loss of the Cyclops was, at least in part, the result of decisions made by Navy officials, decisions that could have been made differently, decisions that might have saved 306 lives. The ship should not have sailed with a broken engine. The cargo should not have been loaded so heavily. The captain's fitness for command should have been more thoroughly evaluated. The inspection reports that might have revealed structural problems should have been conducted and preserved. These are not accusations, they are observations, and the families who kept writing, who kept asking, who kept demanding, they were making the same observations, drawing the same conclusions, asking the same uncomfortable questions. The Navy did not want to answer those questions, and so, over time, the letters stopped coming. The families grew old, the wives remarried or did not. The children grew up without fathers, the parents died without knowing what had happened to their sons. The world forgot, as the world always does, but the questions did not go away, they simply waited. In 1968, 50 years after the disappearance of the Cyclops, a retired Navy captain named Marlon S. Tisdale published an article in the United States Naval Institute proceedings attempting to solve the mystery once and for all. Tisdale had spent years researching the case. He had obtained copies of the original investigation files. He had interviewed surviving witnesses. He had studied the design of the Proteus-class colliers and the behaviour of granular cargoes under stress. His conclusion was the same conclusion we discussed earlier. The Cyclops, the Proteus, and the Nereus had all capsized suddenly due to cargo shift, probably triggered by heavy weather and exacerbated by overloading and structural weakness. Tisdale's article was careful and thorough. It addressed the competing theories and explained why each of them failed to account for the evidence. It provided a coherent explanation for the loss of all three ships. It was, in many ways, the definitive work on the subject, the closest thing to a final answer that the mystery would ever receive. And yet, even Tisdale could not prove his theory. He could not point to wreckage. He could not produce survivors. He could not say with certainty what had happened in the darkness of the Atlantic on that March night in 1918. He could only say what probably happened, what the physics suggested, what the evidence implied. The Navy read his article. The Navy did not change its official position. The cause remained unknown. This is the frustration at the heart of the Cyclops mystery. The most likely explanation is also the least satisfying. Cargo shift is a mechanical failure, a matter of physics and engineering. It does not involve German submarines or secret agents or mutiny or sabotage. It does not have heroes or villains. It does not have a story in the dramatic sense. It is simply a ship that was loaded incorrectly and operated in conditions that exceeded its design limits, and then it was gone. But the human mind does not want mechanical explanations. The human mind wants narratives. The human mind wants someone to blame, someone to praise, someone to remember. And so the theories persist. The German agent theory, the mutiny theory, the Bermuda Triangle theory, which did not exist in 1918 but which would later swallow the Cyclops into its mythology, lumping the collier together with Flight 19 and the Mary Celeste and a dozen other disappearances that had nothing to do with one another except geography. The Bermuda Triangle theory is worth addressing, if only because it has done more than any other to keep the Cyclops in the public imagination. The term itself was coined in 1964 in a pulp magazine article that listed several mysterious disappearances in the waters between Florida, Bermuda and Puerto Rico. The Cyclops was included in the list. Over the following decades, the Bermuda Triangle became a cultural phenomenon, the subject of books and documentaries and television specials, all of them suggesting that something supernatural or unexplained was occurring in those waters. The reality is more prosaic. The Bermuda Triangle is one of the most heavily trafficked shipping lanes in the world. Ships pass through those waters every hour of every day. A certain number of them will sink, just as a certain number of ships sink in every ocean. The disappearance rate in the Bermuda Triangle is not statistically higher than the disappearance rate in comparable waters elsewhere. The mystery is not that ships vanish there. The mystery is that anyone ever thought there was a mystery at all. But the Cyclops fit the narrative. A large ship, vanishing without a trace. No survivors, no wreckage, no explanation. It sounded supernatural. It sounded like a story. And so the Cyclops was absorbed into the mythology, becoming one more piece of evidence for a phenomenon that does not exist. The families of the lost sailors did not need the Bermuda Triangle. They did not need supernatural explanations. They needed something much simpler. They needed to know that someone remembered, that someone cared, that the 306 men who died aboard the Cyclops were not just statistics in a casualty report, but human beings with names and faces and stories of their own. Some of those stories have been preserved, not many. The passage of time and the incompleteness of the record have erased most of what we might have known about the individual sailors who served aboard the Cyclops. But a few fragments survive, enough to suggest the weight of what was lost. There was Lieutenant Commander George Washington Worley Jr., the captain's son. He was 23 years old when the Cyclops sailed from Barbados, a recent graduate of the Naval Academy, serving as an officer aboard his father's ship. Whatever the relationship between father and son, and we do not know the details, only that they served together, that the son's career was shaped by the father's command. It ended in the same darkness, in the same water, in the same silence. 2 generations of a family gone in an instant. There was Chief Machinist Harry B. Carter, who had served in the Navy for 16 years and had just re-enlisted for another tour. He was one of the most experienced men in the engine room, responsible for keeping the ship's aging machinery running, for coaxing power from a broken engine, for making do with equipment that should have been repaired months earlier. He knew the ship's problems better than anyone. He must have known the risks. He sailed anyway, because that was his duty, because that was what sailors do. There was Seaman Second Class Sidney C. Thompson, 18 years old, from a small town in Kansas, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. He had never seen salt water before joining the Navy. He had been aboard the Cyclops for less than 3 months when it vanished. We do not know why he enlisted. We do not know what he hoped to find at sea. We know only that he was young and far from home and that he did not come back. There were Filipino mess attendants and Cuban stokers and men from every corner of the United States, and a few from other countries entirely. The crew list of the Cyclops reads like a roll call of early 20th century America. Irish names and Italian names and German names and names that suggest no particular origin at all. Farmers' sons and factory workers' sons and the sons of sailors who had served before them. They came from different places and different backgrounds, and they were all, in the end, the same. They were sailors aboard a doomed ship, and the sea took them without distinction. We do not know which of them saw the danger first. We do not know which of them tried to launch the lifeboats, if any did. We do not know which of them died quickly and which of them did not. The silence that swallowed the Cyclops swallowed all of that too. What remains is only the absence, the empty space where 306 men used to be. The Navy erected a memorial. It stands at Arlington National Cemetery, a simple granite marker listing the names of the dead. The marker does not explain what happened. It does not offer theories or conclusions. It says only that these men served aboard the USS Cyclops and that they were lost at sea in March 1918. The stone is weathered now, the letters fading. Visitors walk past it on their way to more famous graves. Most of them do not stop, but some do. Even now, more than a century later, people still come to read the names. Some of them are descendants of the lost sailors, carrying forward memories that have been passed down through generations. Some of them are naval historians, researchers, writers trying to understand what happened and why. Some of them are simply curious, drawn by the mystery, wanting to stand in the presence of something they cannot explain. The memorial does not answer their questions. It is not meant to. It is meant only to mark the loss, to say that these men existed, that they served, that they died. The explanation, if there is one, lies somewhere else, in the files of the Navy Department, in the physics of cargo and hull stress, in the dark water where the wreck still rests. Because the wreck is still out there, is somewhere in the Atlantic, probably along the route between Barbados and Baltimore. The hull of the Cyclops lies on the ocean floor. The depth in those waters ranges from a few hundred feet to several thousand. The currents are strong, the visibility is poor, but the wreck is there waiting to be found. Modern technology has made such discoveries possible. Side-scan, sonar and remotely operated vehicles have located shipwrecks that were considered lost forever. The Titanic was found in 1985, more than 2 miles down. The Bismarck was found in 1989. The Indianapolis was found in 2017, 72 years after it sank. The tools exist. The technology is available. The question is whether anyone will use it. Several expeditions have searched for the Cyclops over the years. None of them have succeeded. The search area is vast, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. The ship could be anywhere along its route, or it could have drifted far from its course before sinking, carried by currents or driven by storms. Without more precise information about the ship's last position, finding the wreck is like searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a small state. But the search continues. In 2015, a team of researchers announced plans to use newly available bathymetric data to narrow the search area. In 2018, on the centennial of the disappearance, several maritime organisations renewed calls for a comprehensive search effort. In 2020, advances in autonomous underwater vehicles made it possible to survey large areas of seabed more quickly and cheaply than ever before. The technology keeps improving. The dream keeps alive. If the wreck is found, it may answer some questions. The condition of the hull could reveal whether the ship broke apart, whether it capsized, whether it was struck by an external force. The position of the cargo could confirm or refute the cargo shift theory. The presence or absence of damage could address the submarine hypothesis, the mine hypothesis, the explosion hypothesis. A century of speculation could give way to evidence. But the wreck may also raise new questions. It may show damage that cannot be explained by any existing theory. It may reveal that the ship's final moments were different from anything we have imagined. It may complicate the story rather than clarifying it, and it will not bring anyone back. The sailors of the Cyclops have been dead for more than 100 years. Their bones, if anything remains, are part of the seabed now, mixed with the sand and the sediment and the rusted metal of the ship that carried them down. Finding the wreck would close a historical mystery. It would not undo the loss. This is the hardest truth about the Cyclops, and about all such disappearances. The answers we seek are not the answers we need. We want to know what happened because we believe that knowledge will bring closure, will complete the story, will let us finally set down the burden of uncertainty. But closure is a myth. The families who lost husbands and sons and brothers in 1918 did not need to know whether the ship capsized, or was torpedoed, or struck a mine. They needed their people back. They needed the dead to be alive again. No answer could give them that. No discovery ever will. What remains is memory. What remains is the act of remembering itself, the choice to say these names aloud, to trace these stories, to hold the weight of 306 lives in our minds for a moment before the world moves on again. Chief Boatswain's Mate Frank T. Collins, Fireman First Class John A. Boyd, Seaman James F. Riley, Mess Attendant Second Class Narciso Palacol. These are not statistics. These are not abstractions. These were men who woke up on the morning of March 4th, 1918, and ate breakfast and did their work and expected to see another day. They had plans. They had hopes. They had people waiting for them in Baltimore, people who never stopped waiting even after the waiting was over. The sea does not remember them. The sea does not remember anything. It moves and it shifts and it swallows and it forgets. And a century later it looks exactly the same as it looked on the day the Cyclops disappeared, grey and endless and utterly indifferent to human loss. But we can remember. We can say their names. We can tell their stories, however incomplete, however imperfect. We can stand at the granite memorial in Arlington and read the letters carved into the stone and imagine the faces that once belonged to those names. We can refuse to let the silence have the final word. The Cyclops is gone, the Proteus is gone, the Nereus is gone. 425 sailors, spread across 23 years, all lost to the same water, the same mystery, the same silence. They are not coming back. But they do not have to be forgotten. In the years following the loss of the Cyclops, the United States Navy continued to operate colliers. The war demanded coal, and coal demanded ships to carry it. But the lessons of the Cyclops were not entirely ignored. New regulations were drafted governing the loading of bulk cargoes. New inspection protocols were implemented. The free surface effect, once poorly understood, became a standard topic in naval engineering courses. The deaths of 306 men had taught the Navy something, even if the Navy could not say exactly what had killed them. The Proteus-class colliers were retired one by one. By the time the last of them, the Cyclops' remaining sisters were decommissioned. The age of coal was ending anyway. Oil was the future. The great colliers, the ships that had fueled the fleet, became relics of an earlier era, their names forgotten except by naval historians and the families who had lost men aboard them. And then, in 1941, the Proteus and the Nereus vanished. The news reached the Navy Department in fragments, the way bad news always does. The Proteus, en route from St. Thomas to the mainland with a cargo of bauxite ore, had failed to arrive. Then the Nereus, following the same route weeks later, also vanished. 2 ships, 219 men, gone into the same water that had swallowed the Cyclops 23 years before. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. 3 sister ships, all built to the same specifications, all carrying heavy bulk cargo, all lost on roughly the same stretch of ocean. The Proteus disappeared sometime after November 23, 1941. The Nereus was last heard from on December 10, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, when the nation was reeling from the Japanese attack and the Navy had other catastrophes to process. In the chaos of those early war weeks, the loss of 2 aging cargo ships barely registered in the public consciousness. But for the families, for the sailors' wives and children, the timing was cruel. Their grief was swallowed by the larger grief of a nation at war. The official investigations were brief. The Navy was mobilizing for global conflict. There was no time for extended inquiries into the fate of 2 obsolete colliers that should have been scrapped years ago. The boards of inquiry noted the obvious. The ships were old, their hull plates corroded, their machinery worn. They had been carrying bauxite and ore used in aluminum production, essential for aircraft manufacturing. Bauxite is heavy, bauxite shifts. The free surface effect, the same phenomenon that may have doomed the Cyclops, was mentioned in the reports. So were German submarines, now prowling the Caribbean in greater numbers than ever before. But no submarine commander ever claimed credit for sinking the Proteus or the Nereus. No wreckage was found, no survivors, no bodies, no oil slicks, no lifeboats, nothing. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidental, too strange to be explained. 3 ships of the same class, all vanished without a trace, all carrying heavy ore, all lost in the same general area. The Navy's official conclusion was the same for the Proteus and Nereus as it had been for the Cyclops, cause unknown. By 1941, The families of the Cyclops sailors had spent 23 years waiting for answers. Some had given up. Some had died. Some had simply learned to live with the empty space at the dinner table, the bedroom that stayed vacant, the anniversaries that came and went unmarked because there was no grave to visit, no date of death to commemorate. They had been told their husbands and sons were probably dead. They had been told the Navy was doing everything possible. They had been told to be patient, to trust the process, to accept that sometimes the sea keeps its secrets. And now, in 1941, new families were joining them in the same limbo. Wives of Proteus sailors, children of Nereus crewmen, mothers and fathers who had waved goodbye at the dock and expected a letter, a telegram, a homecoming that never came. The support networks were informal but real. Families found each other. They compared notes, shared documents, passed along rumours and theories. Someone's cousin had heard something from a Navy clerk. Someone's neighbour had a friend who worked at the shipyard where the Cyclops had been built. The information was fragmentary, often contradictory, but the families clung to it because it was all they had. Mrs. Lillian Worley, the captain's widow, had spent the years since 1918 in a peculiar purgatory. Her husband had been accused, in whispers and occasionally in print, of being a German agent. The rumours had never entirely died. Every few years some newspaper would resurrect the story, would speculate that George Worley had deliberately sunk his own ship, had somehow escaped to South America, was living under an assumed name in Buenos Aires or Sao Paulo. The accusations were absurd. There was no evidence, no motive that made sense, no way for a man to survive the sinking of his own vessel in the middle of the ocean. But they persisted, fed by Worley's German birth and the paranoia of wartime. Lillian Worley had her husband declared legally dead in 1925, 7 years after the disappearance, the minimum required by law. She had collected his back pay and his death benefits. She had tried to move on. But the stain of suspicion never entirely washed out. Even after her own death, the Worley name carried a whiff of treason in some circles, the suggestion that something was not quite right about the captain, that a man with a name like Wichmann could not be trusted even posthumously. The German spy theory was always more appealing than the truth. The truth was banal and terrifying. The sea had taken the ship and no one knew why. A conspiracy, a betrayal, a secret mission gone wrong. These explanations gave the tragedy a shape, a narrative, a villain. The actual mystery offered none of these comforts. It was just emptiness, just water, just 306 men who were there one day and gone the next. In 1968, the Navy conducted another review of the Cyclops case. By then, 50 years had passed. The original witnesses were dead or elderly. The documents had been moved, reorganised, some lost to fire and flood and bureaucratic indifference. But the families were still asking questions. The children of the men who died were now middle-aged, and they wanted answers before they too passed on, taking the living memory of their fathers with them. The 1968 review was more thorough than any previous investigation. It had access to records that had been classified during wartime. It had new theories to consider, new technologies to apply. Researchers examined the ship's construction plans, the loading manifests, the weather reports from March 1918. They consulted naval architects and metallurgists. They tried to model what might have happened if the manganese ore had shifted, if the hull had been weaker than specified, if the storm had been worse than reported. The conclusion was the same: cause unknown. But the review did produce one interesting finding. The Cyclops, it turned out, had been overloaded. The ship's design called for a maximum cargo of around 8,000 tons. The manifest from Barbados recorded 10,800 tons of manganese ore. The ship was carrying nearly 3,000 tons more than she was designed to handle. This was not news to everyone. Some of the families had suspected overloading for years. They had heard stories from other sailors, from dock workers, from men who had seen the Cyclops riding low in the water as she left Rio de Janeiro. But now it was official. The Navy acknowledged that the ship had been dangerously heavy. Overloading explained some things. It explained why the ship sat so low in the water. It explained why she might have been slow to respond to heavy seas. It explained the danger of the free surface effect, which would have been amplified by the extra weight. But it did not explain everything. Overloaded ships do not simply vanish. They founder. They sink. They leave wreckage. The Cyclops had left nothing. The 1968 review also examined the maintenance records, such as they were. What emerged was a picture of a ship in decline. The Cyclops had been built in 1910. By 1918, she was 8 years old, which was not ancient for a steel vessel but was old enough to matter. Her hull plates had been repaired multiple times. Her engines were temperamental. Her steering gear had been problematic since at least 1917. There were reports of cracks in her structure, of rivets that had popped, of seams that leaked. None of this was unusual for a working collier. These ships were not pampered. They loaded and unloaded constantly, crossed and recrossed the ocean, took whatever weather came their way. Maintenance was performed when possible, deferred when necessary. The Cyclops was in roughly the same condition as her sisters, and her sisters had served for years after her disappearance without incident, until, of course, they too vanished. The families read the 1968 report with mixed feelings. It confirmed what they had suspected, that the ship had been overloaded, that her captain had been reckless or incompetent, that the Navy had failed to maintain adequate oversight. But it offered no proof, no certainty, no moment where they could point and say, "There, that is what killed them." The mystery remained intact. By the 1970s and 1980s, a new generation had taken up the search. These were not the wives and children of the Cyclops sailors. These were historians, researchers, amateur investigators drawn to the case by its very insolubility. The Cyclops had become famous precisely because it could not be solved. It was a puzzle that resisted all attempts at completion, a story that refused to end. Some of the new searchers were serious scholars. They combed archives, compared ship designs, interviewed the last surviving witnesses. Others were treasure hunters, convinced that the Cyclops had been carrying gold or other valuables, that the official cargo manifest was a cover story, that somewhere on the ocean floor lay a fortune waiting to be claimed. The treasure hunters were wrong. The Cyclops carried manganese, not gold, but their enthusiasm kept the case in the public eye. The Bermuda Triangle theories reached their peak in the 1970s. The Cyclops was featured in every book, every documentary, every breathless television special about the mysteries of the Atlantic. Charles Berlitz's bestseller, The Bermuda Triangle, mentioned the ship prominently, presenting it as evidence of something supernatural at work in the waters between Florida and Bermuda. The families were ambivalent about this attention. On one hand, it kept their loved one's memory alive. On the other hand, it trivialized the loss, turned the deaths of 306 men into entertainment, reduced a human tragedy to a campfire story. The science of the Bermuda Triangle theories was non-existent, of course. Statistical analysis showed that ships and planes disappeared in that area at the same rate as anywhere else in the ocean, accounting for traffic volume. The triangle was a media creation, a way to package unrelated incidents into a narrative of mystery. The Cyclops was not lost because of supernatural forces. She was lost because of steel and water and physics and human error, in some combination that would never be fully understood. But the triangle theories persisted, and in their persistence they revealed something about the human need for explanation. We cannot tolerate randomness. We cannot accept that 306 men might die for no reason, or for reasons so mundane, a storm, an overloaded cargo, a faulty hull plate, that they offer no meaning, no lesson, no story. We need the deaths to mean something. We need the mystery to have a solution, even if the solution involves aliens or time warps or sea monsters. Anything is better than the void. The families understood this need. They felt it themselves. But they also understood something the theorists did not, that their husbands and fathers and brothers were not characters in a mystery story. They were real. They had lived real lives. They had made breakfast on the morning of March 4th, 1918, had buttoned their uniforms, had climbed down into the engine room or up onto the deck, had done the ordinary work of keeping a ship running. Their deaths were real too, however they had died. The Bermuda Triangle was a distraction from that reality, a way of avoiding the simple, terrible fact that the sea had taken them and would not give them back. In 2000, a team of researchers announced that they might have found the Cyclops. Using side-scan, sonar and historical records, they had identified a large wreck in deep water off the Virginia coast. The dimensions seemed right. The location was plausible. For a few weeks the families dared to hope that the long wait might finally be over. It was not the Cyclops. Further investigation revealed that the wreck was another ship, lost at another time, its identity eventually confirmed through hull markings and cargo. The disappointment was crushing, not because anyone had expected a different outcome, but because hope, once kindled, is hard to extinguish. Other wrecks have been found in the decades since. The ocean floor off the Atlantic coast is littered with ships, thousands of them, from centuries of maritime traffic. Any one of them might be the Cyclops. None of them has been. The search continues, in fits and starts, whenever someone secures funding or develops a new theory about the ship's final position. But the ocean is vast, and the Cyclops could be anywhere within a search area of thousands of square miles. The odds of discovery are long. What would discovery mean? Suppose tomorrow a submersible descended to a wreck site and confirmed through hull numbers or cargo or some other distinctive feature that the twisted metal on the seafloor was once the USS Cyclops. What then? The families, such as they are, the great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of men who died before their parents were born, would finally have a location. They could say, there, that is where he lies. There would be memorial services, perhaps, official ceremonies. The Navy would update its records. The case would be closed. But the how would remain unanswered. A century on the seafloor erases evidence. The currents have scattered debris for miles. The hull, if it still exists as a recognizable structure, has been colonized by marine life, corroded by salt water, crushed by pressure. No investigator, however skilled, could examine that wreckage and determine whether the ship had capsized or broken apart, whether she had struck a mine or succumbed to structural failure, whether the men had drowned in their bunks or struggled to the surface and died of exposure. The mystery would persist, even with the wreck in hand. This is the cruel paradox of shipwreck investigation. We want the wreck because we believe it will give us answers, but wrecks rarely speak clearly. They offer fragments, hints, possibilities. They eliminate some theories and support others, but they seldom provide the definitive narrative we crave. The Titanic's wreck told us many things, but it also raised new questions that have fueled debate for decades. The Cyclops, if found, would likely do the same, and so we are left with what we have always had: the records, the testimonies, the theories, and the silence. The manganese ore that may have shifted, the hull that may have cracked, the captain who may have been reckless or merely unlucky, the storm that may have been worse than anyone knew, the submarine that probably was not there but might have been, the 1,000 small failures that might have combined into one catastrophic failure, or the single massive failure that might have struck without warning. We are left with the names. Chief Machinist's mate Harry G. Erickson, who had served in the Navy for 14 years and was looking forward to retirement. Seaman Second Class William H. Cummings, 19 years old on his first long voyage. Coal passer Robert L. King, who had enlisted just 6 months before and had not yet decided whether to make the Navy his career. Ship's cook First Class James H. Williams, who was known for his bread pudding and was planning to open a restaurant when he got out of the service. These men existed. They had names and faces and histories. They had families who loved them, who waited for them, who spent years and decades hoping for word that never came. They were not abstractions, not statistics, not entries in a ledger of maritime losses. They were human beings, as real as anyone reading these words, as real as you. The Navy keeps their memory in its official records, in the monument at Arlington, in the annual observances that grow smaller with each passing year, as the last people who personally knew the dead pass on themselves. But official memory is thin. It preserves facts. It does not preserve the smell of coal dust in the engine room, the sound of the ship's whistle in the fog, the feel of a pitching deck under tired feet. It does not preserve the last conversations these men had, the jokes they told, the letters they meant to write but never got around to finishing. What remains is the act of attention, the choice to stop for a moment in the middle of a day filled with other concerns, and to think about 306 men who sailed into the grey Atlantic in 1918 and never came home. The choice to say their names, even silently, even to yourself. The choice to let the weight of their loss register briefly before the world pulls you back to its demands. The Cyclops does not need to be found to be remembered. The Cyclops does not need an explanation to be mourned. The men aboard her do not need a solved mystery to deserve our attention. They need only this: someone to recall that they lived, that they served, that they were there on the morning the ship sailed and were gone by nightfall, swallowed by the same sea that swallows everything eventually. The sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, have their own memorial now, their own list of names, their own families who waited and wondered. The same fate, the same water, the same silence. 219 more men joining the 306 who went before them, all lost to the same mystery. There is a naval tradition, old and unbroken, that governs how the service speaks of its dead. The phrasing is careful, precise. A sailor does not die. A sailor is lost at sea. The distinction matters. To die is to cease, definitively, finally. To be lost is to remain somewhere, unknown, unreachable, but not absent. The sea has them, and the sea does not give up what it takes. The families of the Cyclops, the Proteus, and the Nereus understood this better than most. Their men were not dead in the ordinary sense. They were suspended, frozen in the moment of their disappearance, forever sailing toward a port they would never reach. There were no funerals, or if there were, they were empty ceremonies, services without bodies, burials without graves. The families gathered and spoke the words and sang the hymns. But the coffins were symbolic. The graves were markers over empty ground, and everyone knew it. This is what it means to lose someone at sea. The loss is permanent but never complete. There is always the possibility, however remote, however irrational, that the next ship over the horizon might bring news, might carry a survivor, might have found something. The families of the Cyclops sailors lived with that possibility for years, for decades, until they themselves died and passed the burden to the next generation. And so the burden passed, from mother to daughter, from father to son, from widow to grandchild, who never knew the face in the photograph on the mantel. The story of the Cyclops became a family heirloom, carried forward not because anyone expected answers, but because the alternative was forgetting, and forgetting felt like a second death. Consider the Nervig family. Fireman first class. Olaf Nervig had emigrated from Norway at 19, worked the docks in Baltimore for 3 years, enlisted in the Navy because he wanted citizenship and a steady wage. His mother in Trondheim received the telegram in April 1918. She did not speak English. A neighbour translated, "Your son is missing. Ship overdue. No further information at this time." She wrote letters for the next 11 years, addressed to the Navy Department in Washington, asking the same question in halting English learned specifically for this purpose. "Have you found my boy?" The Navy replied each time with the same form letter, the same regret, the same nothing. She died in 1929 without an answer. Her daughter, Olaf's sister, took over the correspondence. She wrote until 1952. Her son, Olaf's nephew, a man who had never met his uncle, wrote a letter in 1978 asking if any new information had come to light. It had not. 3 generations of one family spanning 60 years asking the same question into the same silence. The Nervigs were not unique, they were typical. Every family touched by the Cyclops had a version of this story, a chain of letters stretching across decades, a file somewhere in the Navy's archives growing thicker with each inquiry and each identical response. The bureaucracy was not callous. The men who answered these letters were often genuinely sympathetic, but sympathy could not conjure facts that did not exist. The Navy had nothing to give these families except acknowledgement of their loss and confirmation that the mystery remained unsolved. Year after year, decade after decade, the same exchange repeated itself. "Have you learned anything new?" "No, Mum, we have not. We're sorry." What sustained these families through decades of silence? Hope is too simple a word. Hope implies expectation, and by 1930, by 1940, by 1950, no reasonable person expected the Cyclops to be found. Something else kept them writing, kept them asking, kept them showing up at memorial services and laying wreaths on empty graves. Call it fidelity. Call it the stubborn refusal to let the dead slip into abstraction. Call it love that had nowhere else to go. Mildred Bates was 12 years old when her father, Chief Boatswain's mate Harold Bates, sailed on the Cyclops. She remembered the morning he left, remembered him lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see the ship at the dock, remembered the smell of his wool uniform and the scratch of his beard when he kissed her goodbye. She spent the rest of her life remembering. In 1975, at 70 years old, she gave an interview to a local newspaper in Norfolk, Virginia. The reporter asked what she thought had happened to the Cyclops. She said she didn't know and she had stopped needing to know. What mattered, she said, was that her father had been a good man, a kind man, a man who had served his country and his family with equal devotion. What mattered was that she still thought of him every day, that she still saw his face when she closed her eyes, that she would carry him with her until she herself was gone. The mystery, she said, was the Navy's business. Her business was remembering who her father had been before the mystery swallowed him. She died in 1988. Her children and grandchildren attended the annual Cyclops memorial service for years afterward, laying flowers, reading names, keeping faith with a man none of them had ever met. The memorial itself is modest, a small stone marker at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, easy to miss if you don't know to look for it. The inscription is plain: in memory of the officers and men of USS Cyclops lost at sea, March 1918. No explanation, no speculation, just the fact of the loss and the names of the lost. The Proteus and the Nereus have their own markers now, added later, placed nearby. 3 ships, 525 men, 1 stretch of ocean, one answer that will never come. The markers stand in a row, silent witnesses to the limits of what can be known. There is something almost sacred about those limits. We live in an age that assumes all mysteries are temporary, that sufficient technology and sufficient effort will eventually drag every secret into the light. We sequence genomes and photograph black holes and reconstruct the faces of people dead for millennia. We have grown accustomed to answers. We expect them as a kind of birthright. But the sea does not share our expectations. The sea has its own rules, its own timescales, its own definitions of what matters and what does not. The sea took the Cyclops and kept her, and the sea is under no obligation to explain itself. Perhaps this is why the Bermuda Triangle mythology persists, why the Cyclops keeps appearing in books about supernatural vanishings and unexplained phenomena. The mythology fills a void. It provides an explanation, however absurd, in a case where the mundane alternatives refuse to coalesce into certainty. A ship overloaded with manganese ore in heavy weather is a tragedy. A ship swallowed by forces beyond human comprehension is something else, something that transforms random loss into cosmic mystery, that elevates 306 ordinary deaths into a parable about humanity's smallness against the unknown. The families of the Cyclops sailors have for the most part rejected this mythology. They have no patience for it. Their loss was not cosmic or supernatural. Their loss was specific and human and desperately ordinary. A coal passer named James who played the harmonica, a carpenter named Wilhelm who had just become a father, a captain named George Worley who, whatever his flaws and secrets, was still a man with a wife and a daughter and a life beyond the rumours. These were not characters in a ghost story. These were people. To wrap their deaths in mystery-mongering is to obscure them, to replace their real faces with silhouettes, to make them into props for someone else's entertainment. And yet the pull of the unexplained remains. Even now, a century later, people want to know what happened to the Cyclops. Researchers comb through archives, divers scan the seafloor with sonar and magnetometers. Historians publish papers arguing for one theory over another. The search continues, not because anyone believes the answer will change anything for the families. The families are mostly gone now, passed into the same silence that took their sailors, but because the human mind rebels against permanent uncertainty. We want to know. We feel entitled to know. We cannot quite accept that some questions will outlast everyone who ever cared about the answer. The most recent serious search effort was mounted in 2015 by a team of underwater archaeologists using data compiled from decades of unsuccessful expeditions. They focused on a section of the Atlantic floor northeast of Bermuda, an area of underwater ridges and trenches where wreckage might have lodged and preserved. They found nothing, or rather, they found plenty. The ocean floor is littered with the bones of ships, but nothing that matched the Cyclops. No manganese ore scattered across the sediment, no engine parts from a Proteus-class collier, no hull section bearing the ghost of the right silhouette. The team leader gave an interview afterward in which he admitted the obvious. The search area was simply too vast. The ship could be anywhere within thousands of square miles, and without more specific information about her final position, finding her was essentially a matter of luck. The sea has had over a century to scatter and bury whatever remains. The Cyclops may no longer exist in any recognisable form. She may have been reduced to rust and fragments, spread across miles of seafloor, indistinguishable from the background noise of every other ship that has sunk in those waters across the centuries. This is the likely truth, and it is a hard one. There may never be a discovery. There may never be a definitive answer. The official boards of inquiry will stand forever as the final word. Cause unknown. The families will continue to thin, generation by generation, until no one remains who carries the Cyclops in personal memory. The ship will become purely historical, a case study in naval architecture or wartime logistics or the limits of investigation, studied by people who have no connection to anyone who was aboard. The names will survive in records, but the faces will fade. Harold Bates, and Olaf Nervig, and James Cobb, and Conrad Neville will become entries in a database, searchable and sortable, but no longer quite human. This is what happens to all the dead eventually. The Cyclops is not special in this regard. What makes her remarkable is not her fate, but her refusal to be explained, the way she resists the closure that time usually provides. Most disasters yield to investigation. Most missing ships are eventually found. Most mysteries are solved or at least narrowed to a probable cause that satisfies the professionals and the families alike. The Cyclops offers no such comfort. She remains open, unfinished, a sentence without a period. The sister ships compound the mystery rather than resolving it. If the Cyclops had vanished alone, her loss might be attributed to some singular catastrophe, some unique failure of design or command. But the Proteus and the Nereus vanished too, on the same route, in the same waters, carrying the same cargo, disappearing in the same way. 3 ships, the same story, told 3 times. The repetition suggests a pattern, a common cause, but the pattern refuses to resolve into an explanation. Were all 3 ships structurally flawed? The Navy investigated after the Cyclops and found nothing definitive. Did all 3 encounter weather severe enough to overwhelm them? Possible, but unconfirmed. Did enemy action play a role? No evidence. The Proteus and the Nereus vanished in 1941 during a war, but no German submarine ever claimed them, and post-war examination of German records turned up nothing. The patrol routes were known. The timing was accounted for, no U-boat was in position. What are we left with? 3 ships, 525 men, 1 question, no answer. The sea took them, and the sea kept them, and the sea is not talking. There is a word in Portuguese, saudade, that has no precise English equivalent. It describes a longing for something lost, a melancholy that is also a kind of love, a presence made of absence. The families of the Cyclops sailors knew this feeling, even if they did not have the word for it. They lived with their men's absence as a permanent condition, a room in the house that no one entered but everyone was aware of. They set places at holiday tables for men who would never come. They kept photographs on mantels and letters in drawers. They told stories to children and grandchildren who could not possibly understand what it meant to have someone simply vanish, to have the world swallow a person whole and offer nothing back, not even a body to bury. Saudade is not quite grief. Grief assumes an ending, a point where the loss is acknowledged and the mourning can begin. What the Cyclops families experienced was something else, a grief that could never quite finish, that had no closure because there was no confirmation. Missing is not the same as dead. Missing is a liminal state, a suspension between presence and absence, and the families of the Cyclops lived in that suspension for the rest of their lives. Some found ways to make peace with it, others never did. The fortunate ones had communities that understood, other families from the ship who could share the burden, who did not need the situation explained because they were living it too. The less fortunate were alone with their saudade, carrying a loss that outsiders could not quite comprehend. The annual memorial services were, in part, a gathering of people who understood. The families came together once a year to speak the names aloud, to lay wreaths, to stand in the presence of others who knew what it meant to lose someone to the sea. These gatherings grew smaller over the years, as the original mourners died and their descendants drifted away. By the 1990s, attendance had dwindled to a handful. By the 2010s, the services were sometimes conducted for an audience of 3 or 4. The Navy still sends a representative. The ritual continues. But the living connection to the lost is almost gone. Soon it will be entirely gone. The last person who personally knew a Cyclops sailor will die, if they have not died already. The last person who received a letter from someone aboard the ship. The last person who stood on a dock and waved goodbye. The last person who can say with certainty this is what his voice sounded like. This is how he laughed. That person will pass, and the Cyclops will cross a threshold from living memory into pure history. This is not a tragedy. This is the natural order. Every loss eventually becomes historical. Every face eventually becomes a photograph. The question is not whether the Cyclops will be forgotten, but how she will be remembered. What stories will be told? What meaning will be drawn from her silence? The official Navy position remains unchanged. Cause unknown. 3 words that have stood for over a century and will likely stand forever. They are an admission of defeat, but they are also, in their way, an act of honesty. The Navy does not know what happened to the Cyclops. The Navy has tried to find out and has failed. The Navy could speculate, could issue a probable cause based on the best available evidence, could provide the families with a narrative that would at least offer the shape of an ending. But the Navy has chosen not to. The Navy has chosen to let the mystery stand, to leave the file open, to keep faith with uncertainty rather than manufacture a false conclusion. There is integrity in that choice, however unsatisfying it may feel. The Cyclops deserves the truth, and if the truth is that we do not know, then that is what should be said. Anything else would be a betrayal of the men who died, a substitution of convenient fiction for honest ignorance. The families did not want fiction. They wanted their men back, and when that proved impossible, they wanted the truth about what had happened. The truth is that the truth is lost. The ship is gone, the evidence is gone, the witnesses are gone. What remains is the absence itself, the shape of the mystery, the 3 words that close every inquiry and open every question. Cause unknown. Somewhere beneath the grey Atlantic, in waters that have not seen sunlight since the ship went down, the Cyclops rests, or what is left of her rests. The hull may have collapsed under the pressure of the deep. The manganese ore may have scattered across the seafloor. Dark stones on dark sediment. The engines, the boilers, the coal bunkers, the pipes and valves and fittings that made the ship function. All of it is down there somewhere, rusting, dissolving, returning to the elements from which it was made. And the men are there too, or what remains of them after a century in salt water. Bone becomes calcium, becomes sediment, becomes the seafloor itself. The sailors of the Cyclops have become part of the ocean that took them. They are not separate from it anymore. They are dissolved into the vastness, atoms that were once human scattered through fathoms of dark water. This is not a morbid thought. This is simply what happens. The sea takes everything eventually. Ships and sailors, cargo and coastlines, islands and continents. The sea has all the time in the world, and it is patient beyond human comprehension. The Cyclops fought the sea for a few hours or a few minutes or a few seconds, however long the end took, and the sea won, as the sea always wins. The men aboard had their own fights, their own moments of courage or terror or resignation, and then they too were taken, and the sea closed over them as it has closed over millions before, and will close over millions after. What we can offer them is not rescue. It is too late for that, a century too late. What we can offer is attention, the same attention their families offered for decades, the willingness to say their names and acknowledge that they lived. They were real. They walked the decks of a real ship, ate meals in a real galley, slept in real bunks, wrote real letters to real families who loved them. They had futures they would never see, children some of them would never hold, lives interrupted by something that still defies explanation. They deserved better than this. They deserved to come home. They did not, and now they never will. The sea keeps breathing. The currents move through the deep, following patterns established long before humans built ships to sail above them. Somewhere a whale calls to another whale across miles of black water. Somewhere a storm gathers on the surface, the same kind of storm that may have caught the Cyclops or may have had nothing to do with it. The ocean goes on. It does not remember. It does not mourn. It simply continues, indifferent to the ships it has swallowed and the men it has claimed and the mysteries it has created by its indifference. But you can remember. You can carry for a moment the weight of 306 names. You can think of the families who waited and the letters that never came and the graves that stand over empty ground. You can acknowledge that the sea is vast and old and keeps its secrets, and that some of those secrets are the lives of men who deserve to be found. The Cyclops sailed from Barbados on March 4th, 1918. She was expected in Baltimore by March 13th. She never arrived. No one saw her sink. No one heard a distress call. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies, no debris, nothing. She's still out there, somewhere, in the dark. And so are they.